Joseph and Henry.
Hi, Laura.
Hello.
How are you both?
Very good. Engaged after watching your programme, and I'm absolutely intrigued by the relationship between JD Vance and David Lammy. It's so unlikely, and yet that phone call last night suggests it is real and they are close.
Yes, they're not just fishing buddies. David Lammy told us this morning that after JD Vance piled into the very important and very sensitive debate about the horrendous killing of Henry Nowak, David Lammy told us this morning on the TV that he had phoned up JD Vance, Henry, and told him that he was wrong. Have you spoken to your friend JD Vance about this?
I have spoken to JD Vance.
What
I
did you
spoke
say?
to him yesterday and I told him he was wrong.
I guess if you're David Lammy, that is a sign of the dividend of the relationship that he tried to forge with JD Vance, first when he was Foreign Secretary and now kind of as his counterpart as Deputy Prime Minister. And I think that's one of the interesting questions, is whether from spending so much time trying to get close, succeeding perhaps in getting close to JD Vance, the proof in the pudding is David Lammy being able to call him up and tell him off yesterday, or whether actually what he ought to have been able to get from that relationship is to stop him posting what he posted on X in the first place. And I think that's kind of where the debate is. But no question, it is notable that David Lammy is able to get him on the phone as quickly as he was.
And political friendships can be like really weird, aren't they? I mean, sometimes, very unlikely people end up being mates. So, in this case, they're politically completely at the opposite ends of the spectrum, but they both had time in America. David Lammy spent some time at Harvard. Vance was at Yale. And we know they both like fishing.
And also they both had quite a tough upbringing, an upbringing that David Lammy has talked about as being dysfunctional. They both had absent fathers. JD Vance wrote this book, Hillbilly Elegy, about his childhood, in particular his mum's drug addiction, and they are both Christians. They've both seemingly bonded over that and their faith, having working class backgrounds and yet becoming prominent, powerful politicians.
Well, there's lots to talk about in that relationship and what they said to one another on the phone yesterday, but so much still swirling around a very tricky and important conversation that's been raging in Westminster this week about that mixture of politics, the police and race. And we'll get into that on Sunday's Newscast. Hello, it's Laura in the studio.
It's Joe Pike in the studio.
And it's Henry at home.
So David Lammy was on the TV this morning in the context of all the things that have happened this week. And his job, he was a really interesting person to hear from at this moment. And it was intriguing to me that the government actually decided that he was the person to come out and speak this weekend. It was confirmed quite late in the day this weekend, which I just thought that's interesting. It suggested that, well, either they're having trouble getting anyone to come out and defend the government, or they wanted to have a very careful think about who would be the right person to come out and have a conversation about these difficult issues. And David Lammy is not just interesting because he's powerful, he's the Deputy Prime Minister. Also, he's one of the most prominent Labour politicians of colour. Also, though, he's the Justice Minister, so he's completely sort of steeped in all of this stuff, but therefore he has, a real relevance in this debate for more than one reason.
And also because as Tottenham MP, he was the MP when the riots took place about, 15 years ago after the shooting of Mark Duggan.
Yeah, 2011.
A black man who was shot by the Met Police who were chasing him. And he had a gun, but it was not close to his body when this sort of hard stop by police cars ended. And I suppose, Henry, also, David Lammy is somebody who has a history of tackling that difficult debate of the police and racism and confidence in different communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, David Lammy authored a report on racial disparities in the criminal justice system, actually under the Conservative government. I think it was published when Theresa May was Prime Minister, commissioned by David Cameron, if I'm remembering rightly. But, these are issues which David Lammy was looking at, I guess, partly by dint of his background, partly by dint of his constituency, but also by dint of what he is personally interested in, long before he became Justice Secretary last year. And so it is really fascinating, not just to have his response to this case, which has dominated politics now for a week, and we should just dwell on that. It's very unusual. I am talking about the same thing on the Sunday Newscast with you guys as I was as far ago as Tuesday morning after the case concluded on Monday. And so, I think it is unsurprising in that respect that the government decided to have somebody who is versed in these issues, even if not everybody agrees on what agrees with him on his conclusions, as David Lammy is.
And I think there was a lot actually in the interview. And if you've been following these issues and you are interested in it, I would actually say it's worth going to go and find it on
Definitely.
the iPlayer and watching it. Because one of the things he said, for example, is he doesn't think that there is still institutional racism in the police, which actually, given how Henry's just explained, David Lammy's role in this area for a long time, I thought that was very notable. He did say, though, that there may be instances, and he used the word stereotypes, where white people or white young people were being stereotyped in an unfair way. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but I just think he was actually very thoughtful on this in ways that maybe were a bit unexpected, because David Lammy is also someone who sometimes really shoots from the hip politically. He's sometimes said very punchy things about other politicians. So I would say it's really worth a listen to what he said in its entirety. But I think what a lot of the news will pick up on is JD Vance, his response to what JD Vance said online. And if you've missed it, I think we should just read out part of what he said, because this is the sort of background to why we're having this conversation. JD Vance, the American vice president, said that Henry Nowak, and I quote, should still be alive today, and he would be if the last few generations of European elites had stood their ground against the politics of self-hatred and the mass invasion of migrants, many of whom despise the West and the people who love it. This is how David Lammy explained more fully how he told JD Vance he was wrong. Have you spoken to your friend JD Vance about this?
I have spoken to JD Vance. I
What did
spoke
you say?
to him yesterday, and I told him he was wrong. This has got nothing to do with mass migration. One, let's be clear that obviously since the early 2000s and post-Brexit, migration has come down, but murder has come down too, actually, in our country. And two, the young man who perpetrated this crime was a Brit, born and raised in this country.
So what did you
Nothing to do with mass migration.
What did you say to him?
I told him he was wrong. Now, we had an agreeable conversation, but we disagreed. We've disagreed before on his perspective on Western civilization. I don't recognise that perspective. And actually, Western civilization has always been open to the world, whether it was the Byzantine world, the Levant world, the Silk Road has always influenced Western civilization. So I don't agree with his caricature. He knows that, and we can have that debate and that discussion.
Do you think that he was being provocative deliberately? Do you think he was being racist? Do you think he's
I reminded him that the family have called for calm. They don't want division used on the back of Henry's death. And two, I reminded him also of the online space and how toxic that can become. So look, we had a robust conversation, a respectful conversation. We remain colleagues and friends. We're able to do that. And he has strong held views.
And what was initially a family's tragedy and horrific murder has now become, Laura, an international political debate. And it's interesting, there are so many different aspects of this murder in terms of the political debate it has prompted. You've got the tone of the debate, and that's something you touched on a lot with Zia Youssef from Reform, especially after what Henry Nowak's dad has said. You've got what JD Vance has touched on, which is linking this to migration, and it's not that dissimilar from what Nigel Farage said in his emergency address, although I don't think he necessarily said it in such strong terms. You've obviously got this question over whether race played a role in how the police officers arriving at the scene approached it after they got that 999 call from Vikram Digwa's brother. And then you've got the rules around knives and people carrying knives for religious purposes. Certainly David Lammy seemed less keen, I thought, in getting too involved in discussing that compared to some of your other guests who thought there were questions.
Yes, and the other political parties, Reform and the Tories, have both said yes, those just large knives should not be allowed to be carried on Britain's streets, whether or not they're ceremonial, whether or not they are used in a religious manner at all. David Lammy referred to a debate that has been had about whether or not such a large knife is actually ceremonial, but it was interesting to me that yeah, he didn't sound that enthusiastic about responding to the family's request in that way. But Henry, just in terms of the dynamic in the government here, David Lammy, I think, was very keen to say that he's phoned up JD Vance and told him he was wrong. But then there's also been another intervention from Pete Hegseth, who's the Secretary of State for War. He calls himself in the US the Secretary of State for Defence, that we might traditionally be called. At a D-Day event, you know, the most solemn kind of occasion, he took another pop at European leaders too.
Sadly, today, different European beaches are stormed by different dangerous ideologies. Beaches in Spain, in Italy, in Greece, and Bulgaria. Boats and men arrive. When will European capitals do something about that invasion? Or is it too late? I pray not, and I believe not. The men who fought and died here restored freedom to Europe. That freedom must be maintained by this generation of leaders and warfighters, or what they fought for was merely temporary.
I mean, what do you think the government thinks in private when they see those kinds of comments coming from high-profile American politicians?
Well, I know they're aghast, but in general, I don't know specifically about this Pete Hegseth intervention, but they will be. But they're also not surprised anymore. And I think there is, and perhaps we'll come on to discuss this in the context of defence, you know, there is a growing acceptance at the top of government, and indeed, I think, across the political spectrum in different forms in the UK, that this US White House administration just has a completely different worldview to not just the UK government, but a sort of pretty broad sweep of British politics, and that is going to have consequences for the UK-US relationship. You know, I think in some sense what JD Vance has said and what Pete Hegseth has said is just a kind of natural manifestation of the US security strategy, which we spent a lot of time talking about earlier in this year, where they had a very similar posture towards the West and what they see as the sort of complacent Western political establishment's failures over decades. So in that sense, it's not really a surprise. I think the question really for the government is not just can you get them on the phone to berate them, but what are the implications of the fact that you clearly disagree so profoundly for UK policy?
I was on shift on Friday night, and I was quite surprised after the JD Vance tweet came at about maybe 5 to 6 UK time. Within about an hour or so, there was this number 10 statement, which didn't refer to him by name, but was pretty strong in hitting out at people they describe as trying to interfere in Britain's democracy. So they don't seem to want to launch a sort of battle with JD Vance, but clearly want to make it clear that that their position is that this is unhelpful.
And I think a year ago they wouldn't have done that. And I don't know if you guys agree, but I think the first kind of phase of this government, the first phase of Trump being in the White House, the government was so keen to try and get the trade deal, which they did. They were so keen to try and build a decent relationship with, you know, the freewheeling, unpredictable Trump administration, that they often held back. You know, the narrative you'd often hear from government sources was like, well, we're just not going to get into it. We're just not going to say anything. I think that's shifted actually now. Yeah. Trump is sort of hurtling towards the midterms, that they are, you know, after everything, especially after Trump has been so overtly critical of Starmer repeatedly, they're less shy about coming forward, whether they're naming people or not, much less shy about making very plain their view of American outbursts, which many people in Labour, particularly many newscasters, might think they are outbursts. But actually, as Henry was reminding us, they are part of a carefully calibrated political strategy. They're not just outbursts, you know, Donald Trump or JD Vance, or it's not just JD Vance in a bad mood and wants to have a go. This was a long argued post on social media, but the government's response to it is much more trenchant than it once was.
And has the government's response changed because they've decided it's going to change, or has the Iran war in particular and the pressure the PM was put under, and of course the pressure to explain why he didn't let US aircraft take off in the early stages from UK bases, it sort of forced him to explain in some ways that difference. And of course, they've also fallen out over Chagos and those comments Donald Trump made about UK service personnel and their role in the Middle East. The relationship has fractured. And I suppose there are political advantages, as you say, for Labour members and for UK voters to make the difference clear.
I think that's right. I mean, the context has changed for all the reasons that you've just taken us through. And there's a different ambassador to the White House from the United Kingdom. Maybe that's made a bit of a difference too. I don't know, Henry.
I think it was Greenland when it first shifted, actually. If
Right.
you remember, at the start of 2026, there was a kind of 1-2 of geopolitical interventions from Donald Trump. And the first was Venezuela. And the UK government essentially said, not our issue, not our part of the world. We're not getting involved. And didn't condemn him and came under a bit of pressure over that, but ultimately didn't bow to it. And then a few weeks later, when Donald Trump was threatening to capture territory owned by a fellow NATO member, well, that became unsustainable for Keir Starmer, and he was pretty critical then. And, I think he got a taste for it anyway. I think he got a taste for actually it being much more pleasant for him in the House of Commons to stand up and lambast President Trump rather than defend himself against Labour MPs who would have liked him to be much more critical of President Trump. And then, of course, Iran, where they ended up on very different sort of sides, if you will, of how to respond to Iran and how to deal with Iran. And look, I mean, I think it's sort of inconceivable now when you get a tweet like that from JD Vance for the UK government to say anything other than criticising him. And that is a measure of how fast things have moved just in 6 months or so.
It was interesting too, though, that the Reforms, Zia Youssef, didn't really have anything to say this morning. So said, I don't really have a view about that. I'm paraphrasing.
Did not want to engage, really.
Yeah, and that was interesting because he was clear actually to say he didn't have any personal links to the Trump administration, which I thought was interesting because Reform obviously does have.
Nigel Farage has had them for
absolutely
decades
absolutely.
with that part of the MAGA right.
And is very proud of it. And he used to go and campaign sometimes for Trump. And, he's always telling us when he's gone off to Mar-a-Lago.
And Farage did retweet JD Vance's tweet on Friday.
That's what I was about to say. And you're right to highlight that, Joe, because this is more than just, Nigel Farage has got some mates in the Trump administration. Something like him resharing the post online might sound small, but it does illustrate that there is something of a sort of ideological coming together here. And there are things that Reform's playbook, if you like, has in common with Donald Trump's playbook. They are often trying to hit on the same kind of issues, the same kind of sentiment that many voters feel, really frustrated, really hacked off that the status quo has not helped them. And while this is about race and policing, and of course we must say at its heart this story has come from a terrible tragedy that happened to one family and a murder, it has been an illustration of one of those aspects of the political environment that we live in now, which is a sort of transatlantic online sort of ecosystem, if you like. I don't want to sound too pompous, but that does exist, particularly on the internet. There is a kind of ecosystem, particularly on the right, where people are sharing ideas, they're sharing posts online, they're making similar arguments, and there are parallels there, and that's part of the political world that we live in now.
And also, I thought it was fascinating how you pushed Zia Youssef for clarity on what contact Reform UK have had with the family of Henry Nowak, because so much of the debate around the appropriateness of what JD Vance has said or otherwise, and Nigel Farage and other politicians have said, is this what the family would have wanted?
So I can tell you two things on this. Everybody listening, I'm sure, will have heard the families speak on the steps of the court on Monday and say the contrast between how their son's killer was treated and how their son was treated was unbearable. So they've made plain that they are furious about what's happened with the police and they want answers and an accountability on that. But they said very clearly and very prominently they did not want this to be a subject of division, and they didn't want there to be a huge political argument about this. That is what has happened. And Nigel Farage, within 24 hours, did that campaigning video, which he called an emergency address to the nation, discussing the case and making broader arguments about how the white community is treated versus ethnic minority community. When talking to the family's representatives in the last couple of days, they said to me they wanted to reiterate the message that they didn't want the case to be used for there to be any division or any hate on Britain's streets. Now, they're not saying overtly that they are unhappy with Nigel Farage, but the Police and Crime Commissioner, Donna Jones for Hampshire, who has been helping them, told me that what Farage had done and said was unacceptable, and that the family wanted to reiterate their view that they didn't want there to be stress and strife out of this, and they'd asked her to represent them. So that, reading between the lines, I think that's quite a strong message that the family is very unhappy at how this has all played out. The second question is when you ask about direct contact. So we know that the family met the Prime Minister. We know that they met Kemi Badenoch. We know that the Home Secretary and various other politicians had been in touch. I've been told that there was no direct contact from Reform to the family until Thursday, and that there is still, as I've been told, been no direct contact between Nigel Farage and the family. Now, he's said publicly that there is an arrangement to meet the family and they're going to meet in due course. I've been told that's not the case. There isn't an arrangement, and there has still, as we record on Sunday morning, been no direct contact between Nigel Farage and the family.
Another thing the family seemed keen to explore was a review of the rules around people carrying knives for religious reasons. And both Reform's Zee Youssef and Claire Coutinho made their views clear this morning on your show, Laura, that they would ban these ceremonial knives if they are long.
We should also just say in the context of this conversation, and we talked about it a lot yesterday, but the big picture has shown for decades very obvious patterns that it's ethnic minorities that get a rougher ride from police and the justice system. You know, that is the big picture and that is the pattern. What this conversation is really about is whether or not there has been, to use a phrase, an overcorrection in recent years in order to try to solve that long-running problem. So that's really where we are. I just want to close this bit of our conversation without just reminding people that is the big picture. There's been many reports, including recently, that have highlighted genuine problems with racism in the police force. So
Absolutely.
that's where this all comes from. And that's also why it's so fraught.
And Charing Cross Police Station was the example that
Yeah.
David Lammy mentioned, a central London police station where, well, there's a whole panorama about it, which is really worth watching in terms of how police officers treated people coming into their care effectively.
Now, another sticky problem for the government this weekend has been dither, delay, indecisiveness over defence. And Henry, I feel like we've talked about this quite rightly so many times at the weekend on Newscast, not just where's the government's defence investment plan, but this whole issue of the gap between politicians' rhetoric, which is, country, be very aware, we are in a pre-war state, things are very, very dangerous, it's the most dangerous time for decades, and then the reality of what they're actually doing about it.
Yeah, we've talked about it again and again because it clearly is one of the issues of our times. And what the Defence Investment Plan is, which in the government's own admission is overdue. Keir Starmer several months ago appeared before MPs. The liaison committee of sort of select committee chairs put together and told them that there was a debate in government about this plan and it was on his desk and he was going to fix it. And it's not yet been made public, but the Defence Investment Plan is supposed to be coming very soon, perhaps even actually this coming week now. And it's to flesh out details of the Strategic Defence Review, which Keir Starmer commissioned when he came into government. And that Strategic Defence Review was led by a former Labour Defence Secretary, a former NATO Secretary General, Lord Robertson. A lot of newscasters will remember that a few months ago, he went public with his frustrations that he didn't believe the government was putting enough money into defence. And that is another reason why so many people are watching this Defence Investment Plan closely to see if what the government commits matches the scale of their rhetoric about the moment of peril that the world, as well as the UK, is in.
And for context, the chat in Westminster has all been that basically there's a big hole in the budget, so that the government has gone out and promised massive increases. They've already increased the defence budget, but they have agreed to huge increases in the coming years. And essentially, the chat has all been, they've made that promise, but there's an absolutely massive gaping hole where the money's going to come from. And I was intrigued this morning to ask David Lammy, well, if this means that you have to pony up some cash from your own budget in order to pay for this very expensive defence priority, would you be up for it?
He didn't completely rule that out.
No, he didn't. He said defence is the most important thing. Defence is the first priority for the nation.
Yeah, he was intriguing on that, and I'm also interested, and if you have an opinion on this, Henry, to what extent is the fact that Keir Starmer may have a sort of ticking clock above his premiership impacting on all of this? Because if it is a huge bit of public spending, and if cuts to other departmental budgets need to happen to pay for it, and other departments, public service departments that Labour MPs worry about, or maybe it's welfare spending, they worry about that too. Clearly, we've seen to what extent is something that Keir Starmer announces, maybe in the final weeks of his premiership, something that actually really matters?
Well, I think it probably affects things in two ways, the possibility that Keir Starmer is winding down his premiership. One is that we've seen with prime ministers in this phase before, they seek legacy projects. Mm-hmm. Never forget that the UK's legal commitment to meet net zero by 2050 was legislated for by Theresa May in her actual lame duck period. Exactly. And there was almost no House of Commons debate by a quirk of the mechanism used. And obviously it's one of the most significant things that any government has done in recent decades. And another thing that might go into the legacy bucket, which we're expecting to hear things about in the next few weeks, is kids' social media and what the government is doing about that. And obviously we've spoken loads about that on Newscast, and Laura has on her programme. So I think it affects things in that way, but I think it also affects things in another way, which is that if you are a cabinet minister and the Prime Minister is saying, I demand that you trim your budget beyond what we'd previously agreed because that money now needs to go on defence, you're not necessarily thinking, oh, I must please the Prime Minister before the next reshuffle. You're thinking, I've got more political longevity than him here. I can just tough this out and keep saying no and have this debate with Andy Burnham instead. Of course, we should also reflect that I think one of the big things that's happened this weekend is Downing Street has let it be known. Yeah. Keir Starmer does not believe his premiership is winding down. Keir Starmer has let it be known that he wants to fight on, even if Andy Burnham challenges him for the leadership in, what could be as soon as 2 weeks' time.
And it's also possible that they might end up in a real you first moment. So if Andy Burnham wins, and that's absolutely not certain at all, but if Andy Burnham wins and he comes down to London, to Westminster, his supporters will all be delighted. But some of them are sort of saying, well, they kind of want to wait and see what Keir Starmer says about that. Keir Starmer's not going to throw in the towel. And Keir Starmer's lot, some of his people want to wait and see what Andy Burnham says about it. And it's not impossible you end up in this completely sort of tumbleweed moment where neither of them kind of want to go over the top. And you might end up in a really strange situation where, of course, the really important thing to say about that is what then happens during that time. Well, how does anyone in the government then make a decision? Does anything happen, or do you just get more delay, which is exactly what MPs have been pointing to in this really scathing report about the government's approach on defence, is basically that the delay has damaged the industry, it's damaged the UK's relationship with allies, it's essentially, by extension, meant that the UK is not as prepared as it should be for conflict. And if you have a prolonged period of political uncertainty, that's going to be repeated right across the terrain. And, for all that, it's kind of fun and games in Westminster to think about the leadership. What Labour came in promising was stability, because the Tories doing all this, political shenanigans and nonsense meant that they didn't govern the country properly. The biggest criticism of what Andy Burnham has been up to is, of course, by trying to provoke this, he's repeating that mistake.
Yeah, on the point of Makefield, it's worth pointing out a full list of all the candidates is on our website. Reform's candidate is Robert Kenyon. And ahead of that result, Henry, MPs, certainly that I bumped to over the past couple of days, I'm sure you have this week too, are watching all the interviews and media interventions of all the potential candidates. And their minds are sort of slightly shifting. And also a lot of them, I think, because self-interest is such a big part of politics and political careers, are working out whether there's a job for them in a new administration, whoever leaves it, or if a Keir Starmer survives.
Yeah, I mean, look, every Labour MP goes to campaign in every by-election always, but there is a particular character to some of the selfies that you're seeing posted on social media at the moment by Labour MPs, including sometimes quite senior Labour MPs, alongside Andy Burnham. Look, we all know what's going on, and Keir Starmer knows what's going on. And there is just this big cliffhanger in British politics at the moment, which is what happens in 11 days' time in the constituency of Makerfield. And then, as Laura says, the great uncertainty about how the story develops after that, even though we all sort of know a bit further down the track that it is going to result in a Labour leadership election of some form, but triggered by whom and when, we don't know.
I'm just happy it gives me another reason to say Makerfield or Breakerfield. I'm so proud of that.
Such a line. And there are examples.
So happy about it.
There are examples in British politics as well. I mean, it's more Tory PMs than Labour ones, of course, of Tory PMs facing up against their critics.
Oh yeah, come and get me if you're hard enough.
Yeah, I mean, if you think of Thatcher or Major, or in different ways, Johnson and May actually have faced up against rivals. So Keir Starmer seems to be trying to follow that play. But the problem is that I don't think we've seen, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, we've not seen necessarily a full leadership election take place with an incumbent, which could, if it doesn't go well for Keir Starmer, be a pretty embarrassing footnote on his legacy. And when you are trying to talk about legacy and leave office as a statesperson, this is the man who's invited Volodymyr Zelensky and Macron Merz to number 10 today. Would that be just a really embarrassing sort of final few weeks that everybody would remember, instead of a speech you try and give on the steps of Downing Street with a list of achievements?
I don't know. In the end, they're all dragged out with their fingernails scraping down the green baize of the cabinet table, and we don't know what's going to happen. We don't. Maybe they'll all bottle it. Maybe there won't be any contest at all. Who knows? But it is going to be very intriguing to see for sure. No doubt about that. We should just say it's lovely to have you with us, Joe, and I've enjoyed your company this weekend and last weekend. But some people have been getting in touch just to say, where's Paddy? Is he
I've been
okay?
getting in touch for that same reason too.
Oh, have you? So Paddy is fine. He has been in France because people will know this from part of his broadcasting history. He has been at the D-Day, some of the D-Day commemorations in Normandy, and he will be here next week. So don't worry, Pads is fine.
Fantastic. Good to know. We had the welfare check.
So Paddy will be here with me next week when we'll talk more about Makerfield or Breakerfield.
I look forward to listening.
Thank you very much indeed for being with us, newscasters.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.